The plastic chair was biting into my left thigh. Hot, cheap vinyl pressed up against the thin navy cotton of the dress I bought at the clearance rack last Tuesday. I kept shifting, trying to peel my skin away from the synthetic surface, but the heat outside that tent was a monster. June in coastal Virginia always promised humidity you could chew on, and today delivered. I smelled like bad aerosol hairspray and fear. I pulled the collar of the dress away from my neck, letting a puff of hot air fan the sweat pooling just below my hairline. My hair felt heavy, pinned up with 3 crooked bobby pins that were already slipping. I probably looked like a wet cat wearing a suit. And then there was Eleanor. She sat 2 seats over, perfectly perpendicular to the proceedings. Eleanor Hayes, the grandmother, the judge, the warden. She didn't sweat. Or, if she did it discreetly, underneath the expensive French silk of her pale lavender suit. Her hair, the color of fresh snow and lacquered into a helmet, hadn't moved since 1985. She smelled like money and lilies, a scent designed to make my discount perfume smell like gasoline. I watched her hand, manicured and ringed, reach up to adjust the single strand of pearls around her throat. She wasn't looking at the stage, where the assistant principal was drone-reading the list of academic achievements. She was looking at me. Not directly, not yet, but I felt the heat of her gaze, the low-level radiation of 12 years of disapproval, burning a hole through the cheap fabric of my borrowed dignity. Unfit. That was the word she loved. She'd first used it when Alex, my son, was 6. I'd worked a double shift at the diner, the late shift because that paid best, and I'd missed the school assembly where he played a plastic recorder. I got home at 2 a.m., slept 3 hours, and dragged myself to the morning shift at the convenience store. Eleanor was waiting on my porch that afternoon, her mouth a tight, perfect line. "You missed his performance, Lauren. That's neglect. You're an unfit mother." It didn't matter that I was paying for his asthma medication and the private tutor she insisted he needed. It didn't matter that I was working 80 hours a week to keep the roof over the rental house, the roof that leaked every time it rained, the house she called a deplorable slum. All that mattered was the absence. My absence. I pressed my heels into the damp earth under the folding table. My feet were throbbing. The left arch always seized up when I stood too long, or sat too long, or did anything that wasn't lying flat on my back trying not to think about the debt. These shoes, too, were clearance, stiff leather pumps that had already chafed a blister onto my right pinky toe. I could feel the sticky, hot throb now, a small, persistent reminder of physical reality, grounding me away from the dizzying vortex of Eleanor's scrutiny. "Mrs. Hayes?" She'd corrected me once, 3 years ago, when I tried to call her Eleanor. The title denotes respect, something you haven't earned. She had earned it, though. She was the one with the trust fund. She was the one who hosted the garden parties. She was the one who bought Alex the ridiculous, expensive scientific toys that I couldn't afford to keep batteries in. And she was the one who, every time Alex achieved anything, a perfect test score, a school award, the state science fair, made sure to comment, loud enough for me to hear, "He gets his brains from the Hayes side, thankfully, despite the chaotic environment he's forced to tolerate." I gripped the program in my hands. The paper felt slick. My palms were sweating badly. The principal finally finished his preamble, his voice echoing slightly off the cheap, temporary aluminum walls of the outdoor structure. There was a brief silence, broken only by the whirring of a massive industrial fan struggling to move the stagnant air. Now they were announcing the special awards. I looked at Alex. He was sitting in the front row, wearing the heavy black cap and gown, looking impossibly broad-shouldered and mature. He was tall, too tall for me to easily hug now, which felt like a betrayal of time. His hair, dark and thick, was sticking out slightly from under the mortarboard. He fidgeted with the tassel. He looked nervous, but mostly determined. When they announced the valedictorian, the microphone whined with feedback, a sharp, piercing sound that made everyone wince. And now, we present the valedictorian of the class of 2024, graduating with the highest honors, summa cum laude, Mr. Alexander Hayes. A smattering of applause. It was loud, but it sounded thin in the huge open space. I couldn't breathe. Not because I was proud, though I was, devastatingly so, but because now he had to walk. He had to stand there, on that stage, in front of everyone, in front of Eleanor, who was already smoothing the imaginary wrinkles from her skirt. My stomach twisted into a tight, cold knot. I hadn't eaten anything solid since yesterday afternoon, just black coffee and 2 energy bars. Money was still tight, even now. The rent was due next week. I had calculated the cost of the graduation lunch, the stupid, obligatory, fancy lunch Eleanor had insisted on hosting, and realized it was the precise amount I needed for the car insurance deductible. Alex stood up, looking slightly awkward in the long robe. He walked up the temporary stairs, his black shoes clicking against the hollow wood. He reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out over the sea of faces. He searched for me. When his eyes landed on mine, a tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It was the same smile he used to give me when he was 6, and I finally made it home from the late shift, pulling him close for a hug that smelled like stale grease and industrial cleaner. A smile of recognition, of shared secrets. Eleanor cleared her throat, a dry, loud sound, a noise that demanded attention and propriety. Alex took a deep breath. His hands gripped the sides of the podium. His voice, which had recently dropped into a gravelly baritone, wavered slightly on the first word. Principal Thompson, faculty, proud parents, grandparents, and... He paused, his gaze sweeping slowly across the crowd, locking back onto my tired face. I felt my lungs seize up. My heart was hammering so hard it felt like it might rip right through my ribcage. I was thinking about the speech he'd practiced in the kitchen last night, pacing the worn linoleum floor. It was good, standard stuff. Thanks to teachers. Thanks to friends. He swallowed hard. He straightened up, the movement pulling the heavy fabric of the gown tight across his shoulders, and especially the people who actually made this happen. I saw Eleanor stiffen beside me, her head tilted, the precise angle of a hawk identifying prey. Her lips moved, forming the silent, critical shape of a word I knew, refined. She wanted him to be refined. Alex's eyes didn't leave mine. His voice, when he started again, was steady, loud, and utterly without hesitation. It was the voice of a man, not a kid. Most people start these speeches by thanking their village, their support system, the big, rich safety net that caught them when they fell. He paused, letting the silence hang heavy, thick with the afternoon heat and expectation. I felt a sudden, sharp panic. He was deviating. This wasn't the speech. I looked quickly at Eleanor, whose face had gone perfectly blank, the most dangerous expression she owned. I didn't have a village, Alex continued, his eyes drilling into mine. I had a single person, and that person wasn't a net. She was a ladder, a terribly constructed, rickety, worn-out ladder, built from scratch out of scraps, held together with grit and duct tape and sheer, unreasonable will. A nervous, confused murmur ran through the audience. I heard a small, sharp intake of breath beside me. Eleanor. My entire body felt cold despite the heat. I knew where this was going. I wanted to sink through the floor. I wanted to be anywhere but here, trapped between the cheap plastic chair and the judgment in the lavender suit. This is supposed to be the part where I talk about the late nights studying, the discipline, the commitment to excellence, Alex said, leaning slightly closer to the microphone. And I did all that. I pulled the grades. But the discipline? The commitment? That didn't come from a textbook. It came from watching someone else fight. He gestured vaguely with one hand, a wide, sweeping movement that encompassed the entire world outside the tent, the world where I spent my hours. It came from watching my mother wake up at 4 a.m. to start her shift at the gas station, come home smelling like diesel and stale coffee, eat a quick meal standing up, and then leave for her second job at the assisted living facility, where she cleaned bedpans until 11 p.m. The audience was dead silent now. The only sound was the clicking of a camera somewhere in the third row. It came from knowing that every single light bill, every meal, every pencil I ever used, every dollar for this education was paid for with calluses on her hands and 3 hours of sleep, max. For 12 years, she worked 3 jobs. Not 2, 3. My vision was blurring. Tears were pushing, hot and desperate behind my eyes. I blinked hard, fighting them back. I couldn't cry. Not in front of Eleanor. Eleanor was rigid. She wasn't looking at Alex anymore. She was looking straight ahead, at the American flag hanging limp beside the stage, as if willing the ceremony to simply cease to exist. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her pearl handbag. Alex's voice softened slightly, but lost none of its intensity. I know what people say about single mothers who work like that. I know the gossip. I know the judgment. I know the questions. Why isn't she home? Why is she always late for pickup? Why does he eat frozen pizza so often? He let the questions hang in the air. They were Eleanor's questions. They were the ammunition she had used against me for over a decade. Unfit. Alex leaned back, looking older than 18, looking like a lawyer delivering a closing argument. They say that a mother who is gone all the time is a bad mother, a distracted mother, an unfit mother. The word landed like a stone in the heavy silence. I flinched. The heat of the sun, the tightness of my dress, the pain in my feet, all of it vanished. I was just pure, raw nerve endings. He paused for a long, deliberate moment. He looked past the cameras, past the administrators, past the perfectly coiffed hair of his grandmother. He looked right at me. But I'm standing here today, valedictorian, because I learned the difference between presence and sacrifice. He lifted his hand and pointed directly, unmistakably at me. The movement was sharp. So this honor, the highest honor this school can give, it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the woman who missed my recorder concert because she was making sure I had shoes for the next year. It belongs to Lauren. The name hung in the air. Lauren. Not Mrs. Hayes. Not Mom. Just my name. Shouted like a battle cry. The applause started small, confused, but quickly swelled into a loud, genuine wave. People were turning around. They weren't looking at Alex anymore. They were looking at me. I could feel my cheeks burning, fire spreading across my face. I gripped the program so tightly the paper edges were digging into my skin. Next to me, Eleanor made a sound. It wasn't a cough or a whisper. It was a low, guttural noise of absolute, devastating fury. Her immaculate composure was crumbling. Her face, usually so smooth and unreadable, was contorting. She looked like a statue that had cracked open to reveal something ugly and sharp inside. The work was the love, Alex said, his voice ringing with pride and authority. Every hour she spent away was a testament to how much she cared. She gave me everything she had, and she never, ever once complained. He moved his hands from the podium. He took another deep breath. I could see the final, devastating turn coming. I could taste the victory, sharp and metallic. And for anyone who ever looked at her struggle and called her unfit, Alex stated, his voice dropping an octave, becoming cold, focused rage under a veneer of academic decorum. He was addressing the entire crowd, but he was talking to only one person. I want you to understand something very clearly. I looked at Eleanor. She was trembling. The pearl necklace was vibrating slightly on her chest. Her eyes finally met mine, and they were filled with sheer, unadulterated hatred. Alex raised his head slightly. My mother is the strongest, most ethical person I have ever known, and I am only here because she had the courage to sacrifice the time she wanted to spend with me, so I wouldn't have to work 3 jobs when I was 18. He leaned in one last time. So, Grandma, he said, the word cutting through the microphone feedback like a knife. He didn't look at her, but everyone knew who he meant. This one's for the single, working mothers everywhere. The ones who are called unfit. We know the truth. He reached down and pulled the rolled diploma from the podium surface. He held it up high, a stark white scroll against the black gown. I did this for you, Mom. Thank you. He stepped back from the mic. The applause erupted. It wasn't polite anymore. It was loud, chaotic, a standing ovation that crashed over me like a wave. People were shouting my name, Lauren. My hands flew up to cover my mouth. I finally let the tears fall, hot and messy. I looked at Eleanor. She was on her feet, not applauding. She grabbed her handbag, her movements jerky and violent. She didn't say anything. She just turned her back to the stage, turned her back to Alex, and shoved past the people in the row behind us, moving quickly, blindly, towards the exit, her silk lavender suit vanishing into the blinding sunlight outside the tent. She was gone before the standing ovation ended. I sat there, paralyzed, watching the empty space where she had been. The plastic chair was still biting my thigh, but the pain in my feet didn't matter anymore. The cheap dress didn't matter. Alex was walking down the steps, searching for me in the crowd, the happiest smile I had ever seen plastered across his face. I finally managed to stand up, shaky, pulling myself out of the row, ignoring the hands reaching out to pat my shoulder. I needed to get to him. I took one step, and then another. The ground beneath me felt soft, unstable, like I was walking on water. That's when I saw the phone lying on the vinyl seat where Eleanor had been sitting. Her expensive silver phone. She must have dropped it in her rush. It was ringing. A private number. I hesitated, breathing hard, looking up at my son who was only 10 feet away. The screen lit up again. Private number. I reached out and picked it up. Heavy, solid, cold metal in my damp hand. It rang again. I answered it. A voice, deep and familiar, rasped into my ear. "Mom? Did you hear that garbage? Tell me she finally shut up." It was Jason, Alex's father, my ex-husband, Eleanor's son. I hadn't heard his voice in 5 years. I felt the blood drain from my head. I pressed the phone tight against my ear, the sound of the celebrating crowd muffled by the ringing silence of the call. "Jason," I whispered. "Lauren, why do you have my mother's phone? What happened? Did she finally lose it? That kid sounds like a lunatic, dedicating his whole speech to poverty. Did she get mad?" I took a slow, agonizing breath, tasting the dust and the shame and the sudden, sick realization of what this call meant. "She left," I managed. "Good. Look, I need you to do me a favor. A big favor." His voice was low, conspiratorial, the same tone he used when he was about to ask me to lie for him 15 years ago. "I'm in trouble. Serious trouble. I need a place to crash for a few weeks until things blow over. I saw Alex's name in the paper. He's graduating. He's 18 now, right? Legally, he can't stop me from seeing him." I looked at my beautiful, brilliant son who was pushing through the crowd, his face shining with accomplishment, with vindication, with pure, unadulterated relief. And then I looked at the phone in my hand, holding the ghost of the past, the source of all the chaos, the reason I worked 3 jobs. "Jason," I said, my voice barely a thread. "Yeah? Just say yes, Lauren. I'm only a few hours outside of town, just for a couple weeks. You owe me this." I didn't owe him anything. I owed him nothing. The air felt thin. The victory of the speech had evaporated, replaced by this sudden cold dread. My vision zeroed in on the scar on Alex's forehead, the faint white line he got when he was 3, when Jason had slammed the car door too fast. I stood there, listening to the static on the line, the joyous roar of the crowd, and the sound of my son's feet running toward me. I looked down at the phone, and then I started walking towards Alex. The phone was slick with sweat. I let it drop into the oversized clutch bag hanging off my shoulder, the battery already dead anyway. Jason's voice was ash in the back of my throat. He wanted back in the story now that the ending looked good. He wanted the photo op. The noise of the stadium was a hammer. 3,000 people clapped and cheered, the sound trapped under the bright, awful June sun. It was 92 degrees. The air smelled like burnt plastic and old sunscreen. I started walking. It wasn't a walk. It was pushing through a human swamp. Every person who stopped me, a kindly teacher, a parent I barely knew, had the same wet, satisfied look on their face. "Lauren, that was beautiful," they'd hiss, grabbing my arm, forcing me to stop and smile. The smiles were exhausting. They cracked my dry lips. I kept my eyes locked on Alex. He was a beacon of white gown and blue sash near the main stage steps. He was laughing, tossing his mortarboard into the air for a terrible picture one of his friends was taking. He looked like the sun itself had finally decided to shine directly on him, and not on the cheap vinyl seating or the dead patch of grass near the scoreboard. I had to get to him before the others did, before the vultures. My polyester dress, the one I'd bought on clearance at Marshall's because I couldn't afford the silk number I wanted, felt like sandpaper. It was sticking to my spine, wet. My head pounded, a slow, deep drum beat behind my eyes. I realized I hadn't drunk anything but bad coffee since 6 a.m. The victory felt dizzying, like standing up too fast after years spent lying flat. I pushed past a family trying to corral a screaming toddler. The toddler was wearing a tiny graduation cap, which seemed ridiculous. I stepped over a discarded program, the glossy paper already curling at the edges from the heat. My gait felt heavy, measured. Each step was 12 years of overtime, 2 hours of bus commute, every missed school play because the night shift had to be covered. Every single step was Carol telling me I was reckless, that I was starving him of opportunities, that he would end up a statistic. And then I saw her, Carol, the source of the static, the constant high-pitched whine in the background of my life. She wasn't near the main stage. She was standing maybe 30 feet away, rooted to the spot near the handicapped seating, looking like she'd been struck by lightning but hadn't quite realized she was fried. She was wearing a cream-colored linen suit that must have cost more than my entire apartment rent. Her hair, perfectly sculpted in silver, was slightly disheveled, which was, in itself, a catastrophe. She was holding her program so tightly the paper was tearing near the spine. Her face, it wasn't anger. It wasn't the usual condescending pity, the look that said, "Bless her heart, she's doing her best with so little imagination." It was something cold and pure. Shock. Dispossession. Alex hadn't just thanked me. He had explicitly named the struggle. He had talked about the dingy laundromat where I folded uniforms for gas money. He had talked about the cold nights when I shared my one slice of pizza with him, pretending I wasn't hungry. He had framed all her criticisms, the poverty, the lack of expensive tutors, the 3 jobs, as the foundation of his success. He had built a shrine to my inadequacy, and in doing so, he had destroyed her narrative. I walked toward Alex, but I felt Carol's gaze like a physical weight pressing against my shoulder blades. I knew I couldn't reach him without passing her orbit. I kept moving. I reached the concrete walkway. The shade offered a slight, blessed reprieve. I was maybe 5 feet away from Alex when Carol finally moved. It was a slow, deliberate movement, like a predator circling a downed deer. She didn't look at me directly. She looked past me, toward Alex, as if I were merely a dirty smudge on the lens. Alex finally saw me. He grinned, that wide, honest grin that still knocked the wind out of me sometimes. He started jogging toward me. "Mom!" He was 6 feet 2 inches now. Broad shoulders, narrow waist. He smelled like sweat and accomplishment. He pulled me into a hug that crushed the air out of my lungs, pinning my arms to my side. I clung to the back of his gown, feeling the rough synthetic fabric under my fingers. The relief of that hug was so vast it felt dangerous, like standing too close to a cliff edge. "You were incredible," I choked out, my voice thick. "It was easy," he whispered into my hair. It was all true. He pulled back, holding me by the shoulders, his eyes shining. And that was when Carol arrived. She didn't push us apart. She just stood there, a few feet away, radiating a controlled, terrible silence that was louder than the surrounding crowd noise. "Alexander?" she said, her voice tight, formal. The name sounded like a charge of treason. Alex turned, dropping his hands from my shoulders. He stood taller. He didn't look excited to see her. He looked politely ready for a dental appointment. "Hi, Grandma," Alex said, his voice flat. Carol didn't look at him. She looked directly at me. Her eyes were pale blue ice, magnified by expensive prescription lenses. "Lauren," she said, letting the name drop. It wasn't a greeting. It was a verdict. "I believe we need to discuss that little performance." I hadn't spoken to her in 6 months. Not since she tried to send me a check for Alex's senior trip, specifically addressed to him, bypassing me entirely, with a note attached about how she was saving him from the indignity of a cheap bus tour. I had torn the check up. My mouth was dry. I swallowed hard. The headache pulsed harder. "It wasn't a performance, Carol," I said, my voice low and level. "It was his speech. He wrote it." "Oh, he wrote the words, I'm sure," she conceded, waving a manicured hand dismissively. She adjusted the cuff of her jacket. "But the message, the narrative, it was deeply manipulative, Lauren. To stand up there and parade poverty like some badge of honor. To make it sound like neglect was a choice. Alex shifted, ready to step in. But I held up a hand. A slight, almost imperceptible movement. I wanted this. I wanted to hear the exact shape of her resentment. Unmasked by the usual pleasantries. "What neglect, Carol?" I asked. She sighed. A sound of profound intellectual suffering. The kind of sound people make when explaining quantum physics to a toddler. The things he missed, Lauren. The opportunities he was denied. He mentioned the laundromat. He mentioned the shared pizza. Do you know how that sounds to the dean of admissions who was sitting 3 rows back? It sounds like we, the family, failed him. It sounds like you deliberately chose to remain perpetually victimized instead of seeking adequate support. "I worked 3 jobs, Carol," I said simply. "I put him through school. I paid every bill. I didn't ask you for a dime, because every dime came with 3 pages of instructions on how I was failing. And the result of that independence is that he had to go to the state school. He didn't get into Brown. He didn't get into Yale. He had the grades for Yale, Lauren. But he lacked the context." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice, creating a bubble of intense venom in the middle of the celebratory chaos. He needed private tutoring. He needed that summer trip to Europe for historical perspective. He needed the right internship contacts. I offered to pay for those things. You refused them because your pride was more important than his future. And now, he's up there, making us look like monsters to justify your terrible choices. I looked at Alex. He was staring at his grandmother, his face a mask of disappointment. He wasn't angry. He was just tired of the script. "Grandma," Alex started, his voice firm. "It's all right, Alex," I said softly, looking back at Eleanor. I felt suddenly, overwhelmingly calm. The pounding in my head eased slightly. I looked at her expensive suit, her perfect hair, the way she stood rigid, convinced of her own moral superiority, and I saw something break behind her eyes. Not sadness, but the stark realization that she had just lost the war. Not the battle, but the entire war for her grandson's allegiance. "You called me an unfit mother for 12 years, Carol," I stated. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact, like the heat of the sun. You told Alex I was ruining him. You told me I was reckless. You criticized the daycare, the public school, the clothes I bought, the food I cooked, the lack of culture in our tiny apartment. She tried to interrupt, a sputter of denial forming on her lips. I was offering guidance. I cut her off. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. But Alex just stood up there. I continued, gesturing vaguely toward the stage, and told 3,000 people and the dean from the state school that everything I did, every single choice, was exactly what made him who he is. I took a small step closer to her. Her perfume, something heavy and floral, hit my nose. He didn't need the private tutor, Carol. He needed a clean uniform and a mother who was always there when she said she would be. He didn't need Europe. He needed to know that working 3 jobs to pay for a cheap apartment was a necessary sacrifice, not a failure. He learned his integrity on the floor of that laundromat, folding other people's clothes with me at midnight, doing homework under the fluorescent lights. The crowd noise seemed to fade out. It was just us. The sun was hot on my neck. You think he lacked context? He learned context every time he watched me get up after 4 hours of sleep to make sure he had breakfast. That's the only context that mattered. Carol's composure finally fractured. Her mouth worked, struggling to find the next crushing argument. She couldn't find it. Her foundation was gone. Alex had publicly confirmed that her entire premise, that only wealth and ease produced success, was a lie. "You have poisoned him against us," she hissed, her voice barely a whisper thick with accusation. "You have filled his head with this proletarian nonsense." I almost laughed. The word felt so ridiculous, so out of place. Proletarian nonsense. "No, Carol," I said, shaking my head slowly. "I didn't poison him. I just fed him, and I loved him, and I paid the rent. That's all I ever promised to do." I put my hand on Alex's elbow. His muscle was solid under my palm. The connection felt vital, undeniable. We were a unit. She was outside the cordon. "We have to go, Alex," I murmured. "I'm starving, and I'm exhausted." Alex didn't hesitate. He gave his grandmother one last, neutral look, devoid of heat or malice, which was perhaps the cruelest thing he could have done. He didn't need to argue with her. He had already delivered his final statement on the matter. "Goodbye, Grandma," Alex said, turning his back on her. We started walking away, toward the parking lot, toward the battered Honda Civic I had paid cash for last year. We took maybe 10 steps. I could still feel her eyes boring into my back. I kept walking, focusing on the cheap, uneven pavement, the heat radiating up through the thin soles of my shoes. Then, she spoke one last time, loud enough for the people milling nearby to hear. The words were laced with pure, desperate malice. The last shot fired from a sinking ship. "You'll see, Lauren. This is temporary. He will realize what he missed out on. He will realize you held him back." I stopped. I didn't turn around. I kept my gaze fixed on the distance, on the line of trees bordering the parking lot. Alex stopped next to me, his hand settling gently on my shoulder. I pulled the now-dead phone out of my clutch bag. It was hot, inert, useless. I held it up, looking at the black mirror of the screen. I knew my face looked tired, lined, and irrevocably triumphant. "Carol," I said, my voice carrying just enough to cut through the din of the crowd. I didn't bother to turn. "He is 22 years old, graduating with honors, and he is walking away from you right now. He already realized." I let the phone drop, letting it hit the concrete with a sharp, ugly clack. It bounced once, then lay still, the glass already cracked from the earlier fall. I didn't look back to see if she bent to pick it up. I didn't look back to see her face. I didn't need to. I linked my arm through Alex's, feeling the weight of the diploma cover tucked under his other arm. "Come on," I said. "Let's go get some pizza. And we're not sharing." He laughed, a genuine rolling sound. We walked toward the parking lot, leaving the noise, the heat, and the history behind us. The only sound that mattered was the rustle of his graduation gown against my cheap dress. The air still felt thick, but it was clean now. We reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline crash. I unlocked the Civic. The interior was already an oven. "You drive, Mom," Alex said, already sliding into the passenger seat. I got behind the wheel. The vinyl seat burned my thighs. I put the key in the ignition. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there, looking out the windshield at the sea of parents and students still celebrating. I reached across the console and put my hand on Alex's knee. "Thank you," I said. It was too small a word for what he had done. He covered my hand with his, squeezing once. "No, Mom. Thank you." I took a deep breath, the hot, dry air stinging my lungs. I turned the key. The engine coughed twice, then caught. The air conditioning sputtered weakly, promising only slow relief. I pulled out of the parking spot, past the milling crowd, past the expensive black SUV I knew belonged to Carol. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I drove toward the exit sign. We merged onto the highway. The sun was blinding on the asphalt. Alex reached over and turned on the radio. It was a terrible pop song. He leaned his head against the headrest, looking tired but whole. I drove toward the setting sun, my hands tight on the steering wheel, the road stretching ahead, empty and wide open. I didn't know where we were going next, but I knew, finally, that we were already there.